All right. Good morning or good afternoon, depending if you are in North America or in Iceland. Uh, I'm really happy to have Steve Steffens here today. He is the great grandson of Helga Baldvinsdottir. Her pen name is Undina, and she is from a farm called Litla Asgersau in the northeast. I'm sorry, northwest of Iceland, but it's northeast of the town Borðeyri. Um, she's the daughter of Baldwin Helgason and Sofio Joseph's daughter, and they settled in Rossio in Muskoka, Ontario, and later in North Dakota, finally settling in Oregon. Undina was married twice. The first husband she had suffered from alcoholism. Their marriage ended in divorce. The second one died in 1904. Then she moved to the west coast of Oregon until her death. She wrote most of her poems at the turn of the century, but little after that. Her poems were very popular, though, and attracted a lot of attention both in Iceland and by Western writers. Her poems are notable for how lyrical they are, and many express a love for her home country. Her best poems, though, are sad and romantic, and they reveal a settler's sense of rootlessness. A complete edition of her poems was published in 1952. As I mentioned, her great-grandson, Steve, who's on the video here, is our guest, and he grew up hearing stories about Helga from her son, Walter, since his childhood, and he had a strong interest in learning more about her work. Over many years, he translated her poems into English in a book called The Poems of Undina. It's available online in multiple locations. He's also written two other books inspired by her life story, A World Away from Home and Further from Home. So today we're going to chat with Dr. Stevens about Helga and her poetry and learn about her journey west. So thanks, Steve, for coming today. And you and I spoke earlier, and you mentioned that you have a poem Helga wrote when she first learned from her father that she was leaving Iceland that you thought would be good to kick us off. Did you want to read that one for us, and then we'll talk about it and some of her other work?
That's great. Let me go ahead and start with that. And this was written when she discovered, right after she discovered that her father financially could not make it. They were moving from farm to farm in northern Iceland in 1870 through 1873. And they just could not get, at that point, there'd been some eruptions. The growing season had shrunk, and he made the tough decision to along with some of the people in the community, to move to Canada. And so this was at 14, she wrote this poem. Once again, I escaped to the hillside where my lily stands so strong. But what makes the water flow down your white petals? Why do you shed such sorrowful tears? You prod my pain until I weep with you. Why must I sail away from here? You float in a sea of damp green grass, and nothing threatens your peace. If I could only stay with you, I'd wipe away my tears and delight in all your beauty. I'd treasure each moment and enjoy every day on this hillside. I'd only talk to you of happy things and never complain of cold winds. But that is not my fate. So I can't hide my tears or hold back my sobbing. In a month, my family is leaving our home, and I love them all, but nothing brings me more happiness than standing close to you. You are as innocent and pure as heaven, but I'm a faint-hearted sinner with an unbearable burden. I'm only a child, but I'm already broken. I sit beside you and speak of my family's journey and how I must go away with them. As the summer sun slowly fades, I bend down and whisper that I love you, and how I hope you'll always be happy on this green, grassy hillside. As for me, there's been no happiness since I've discovered I must move so far from you.
That's an amazing poem.
At 14,
14 years old. That you
I
could
mean,
really see her talent at a very young age.
you know, and part of that, her father had written some poems. I have one of them that maybe I'll share later. And she had a grandfather, a great grandfather that wrote poems, but he only wrote them in Latin, which is interesting. Thomas Thomason. And he wrote them. So she was around a literary family. Her mother and father read constantly, which again is, I suppose that's the Icelandic way, isn't it, Jason?
It definitely is. Do you happen to know who taught her to read and write? Did she learn it at home, or was it someone else in the community, or
You know, I really don't know. I think that you mean Icelandic or English?
Icelandic?
You know, Icelandic, they were on a farm. And again, I've told Jason this and anybody that's listening. I will slaughter the Icelandic words, and I apologize ahead of time.
I think you said confidently slaughter.
I confidently slaughter. And so, you know, when they were in, you know, their final place was Groff. At least it's spelled Groff. I've heard it's Grove or something, that was up in the north western, and they were pretty isolated. So
Yeah.
therefore, my assumption is probably her mother and father. I think she was pretty much homeschooled at that point, but yet the family, again, very educated. When they came to America, one of the things I always heard about her and her brothers, and even seeing pictures of them, is they all had massive libraries.
Yeah.
And they were the most varied libraries. In fact, I inherited somehow trunks full of books, and they were on astronomy, biology, archaeology, literature. I mean, I thought this, they dabbled in everything, which was just so intriguing in this culture that we currently have of specialization.
Yeah. No, I think it's really something when you learn about different households and the variety of books that they had, and the amount of value they placed on education and learning and science and literature, and not just locally in the country, but world literature and
Yes.
going on outside of Iceland.
In fact, for a while, she translated Whitman and Whittier and number of the poets of the time, so she could into Icelandic, so she could share that with the community. But in 1873, a group of them met in Aucuary, and they had an arrangement with the Canadian government. And the Canadian government would provide very cheap passage through, they went from Aucuary down to Aberdeen, Scotland, and then over to Lake Muskoka in Canada. And they were promised land there. So a group of them came. Among the group, it was difficult because they put the Icelanders in with the cattle and the horses, because the ship was bringing Icelandic horses down to Scotland to work in the coal mines. So therefore, all the passengers shared their berth with the horses. which I can't even imagine what was that like. Stefan Stephenson, the poet, was on this trip, and his father actually kept a pretty extensive diary
Mhm.
of that particular journey, which I was able to access. Jacob Lindahl, who was her future husband, also came over on that ship. So,
Why don't you tell us a little about her relationship with Stephen Gay Stephenson? You mentioned they came over on the same ship. Is that where they met? And he
um,
became an advocate for her poetry later and did many other things. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about.
yeah, let me go into that because again, that's an interesting story. I believe they met on the ship, as far as I can tell, because everybody gathered in Octuary at that point, and there was a huge, in fact, a huge group. In fact, the dilemma is there were so many people there that they had to have a lottery who could leave and who had to stay. And the people of Octuary were very negative about those that were leaving. In fact, the saying that my grandfather would say is, "The wind blew hard on northern Iceland, and the chaff was all blown away to America, and the grain settled back to the earth." Now, so
Yeah.
it was hard because so many people left during that time. But in the midst of it, there seemed to be an ongoing communication with Stephenson, and later as Helga married Jacob, part of the communication was Stephen Stephenson had moved down to Gardner, North Dakota. There was a community there at Mountain, Gardner, and several other locations, right in, and was really trying to host and was able to talk Helga's father, Baldwin, into coming down. Now, at that point, Baldwin and his mother, Sophie, and her mother, Sophia, had there was a separation, there was a division there. They were close friends, but there was a religious difference there. So Baldwin came down, bought property alongside Stephen Stephenson, and then talked Helga and Jacob into coming down. And when they came down, Jacob Lindahl, Helga's husband, and Stephen Stephenson started a literary journal, a literary magazine. Now, the magazines at that point, as I've seen a couple of copies of these, are really just they would put together these articles from mainly at that point, Stephen Stephenson. Jacob wrote some, a lady by the name of Carolina Dahlman wrote some, and Undina wrote some, and they put together a little magazine, 3 or 4 pages, and then they would hand copy these and spread them among the community.
So they weren't using a printing press at that point. It was like the old Icelandic practice of handwriting books
yes,
and sharing them. Wow.
I mean it just the labor intensiveness. And out of Stephen Stephenson's home there, they would meet regularly, and they created this literary society that had to do with, again, Carolina Dahlman, Jacob, Helga, and Stefan. And out of that, they ultimately created an Icelandic cultural society. They would read and discuss books, and was a very active intellectual group. Actually, Baldwin, her father, was a part of that too. And at one point, I know that in one of the notes that I saw, she was proud because their little community had now collected 100 printed books.
Wow.
And they were very proud of that.
Yeah. You had mentioned that I don't know if it was Stephenson or the group belief, but they felt that they should become more American, and that American culture valued plays over, let's say, writing novels or poems, and so they wanted to write plays. Can you talk a little bit about that?
In roughly, they had been kind of talking about how isolated they were, which they had this interesting combination. We do not want to merge with American culture when they move down to North Dakota because we're afraid we will lose our distinctiveness, but we also don't want to be seen as outsiders. So they kind of tried to have a foot in both worlds. And so Stephenson I've got it in my notes here, in 1882 decided he would write a 4th of July play. Now it's interesting, it's a 4th of July play that happens in Denmark and Iceland. so I'm not sure, and it's kind of a moral tale. And in this play, her father, Baldwin Helgason, played the king of the king of Denmark. And again, he was a very distinguished man. In fact, here's a photo of him.
So and he made that frame. Is that correct? Did he make that?
Yes, he was he was a metal worker. He also was sort of in Iceland, he had been a worship leader in the local Lutheran church. In fact, when they lived down in Mevaten earlier, because that's where Helga's mother and father were married and where she grew up, her mother grew up, was in the Mevaten area. He was the worship leader and was an amazing apparently violinist, but he was also he created these metal works, and in Hecla when they were there earlier, which is the community that he created in Canada before they moved down to North Dakota. One of the writers say that he and Sophia, his wife, were the center of the community. That's where in their house, they would hold worship services, and he would do the weddings and the funerals. But down here again, Stephenson wrote this play that had a lot of the Icelandic people in it. And it was really a moral tale about hard work and not for being in America, but not ever forgetting your history, which is what Icelandic roots and what we're trying to do here is not forget our roots, which was really what that 1882 play was all about, was that challenge way back then. Don't forget where we came from.
Yeah. That's fantastic. So getting back to her life, she had written a lot. I'd read the book that you translated, and she had written a lot of poems in Iceland, even very young, and then moved to North America. She pretty quickly is in North Dakota for some time. Was she writing poems then, or was she writing mostly poems in Canada, or had she stopped writing poems? Tell us a little about where her life is and as she's down in Garter and what's going on with her poetry.
In fact, the richest period of time of her writings was really the interaction with Stephenson in the 1880s. And he kept pushing her to write. And this was an incredibly active time. And again, she wrote a lot. Here's again, and they were sad. You know, here's One Dreams of You. Let me find my glasses here. And this was written in 1882 when they just, when they were really settling there. This morning, your gentle spirit blew away my shadows and woke me from my sleep. You brought me back to life. Beloved, my eyelids fluttered when I heard your tender whispers, but it was just a dream that drew me so close to you. Brash and bashful like a child, I pray for your protection as your path pulls you away. But I will always wait. Sorrow's knife cuts deep. Its pain clutches at my heart until you return and heal the hurt and hold me in your arms.
Yeah.
One of the things that impressed me as a psychologist is in a time when people were more reserved with their emotions, she really outlines the disintegration and the failure of her marriage in the poems.
Mm-hmm.
And you can really see her struggling. She loved Jacob. She respected him intellectually, but yet Jacob had demons, and he tended to drink a lot. In fact, one of her poems is Too Much Alcohol is the name of the poem, Too Much Alcohol. And when he would drink, he would get physically abusive.
Mm-hmm. And just so people know, his public face was he was very respected in the community, right? He was a treasurer of the church. He was very close with Stephen Stephenson and some of the intellectuals in the community. But in his private life, he had these demons. And is that how you would describe it?
Later on, he actually started a number of businesses. Well, actually, what he would do is he worked later on after they divorced, which again is a fascinating story. He would establish new branches of schools. Of businesses. Like stores, dry food stores. And in the 1890s, he was hired by the local Icelandic newspaper to create a group, to head a group of Icelanders that went back to Iceland to convince more people to immigrate. And so he was a leader in the Republican Party at that point. He was on the nominating committee for getting people to run for various offices. So politically, business-wise, he was very popular and in the church. And therefore, when Helga started pulling away, there was a lot of judgment. And in a horrific situation that happened I'm looking at my notes here, in about 1891, he came home drunk and started beating one of the horses. At that point, they had a 13-year-old daughter, Frederica Josefina, and she was trying to calm down the horse, and the horse trampled her to death.
Horrible.
And at that point, Helga basically said, my children are my priority. I give up on Jacob. And so therefore it's interesting. She asked him to leave. Now, it was interesting because about 2 years earlier, according to the documents, they bought separate farms. So I think they saw that this was coming on. So they each had their own homes which are right now in the area in North Dakota where there's a large Icelandic park.
Mm-hmm.
And their property was right in the middle of that Icelandic park that is currently in North Dakota.
Okay.
So and she just ended up, then her father came in, Baldwin, to protect her, and they went up to Selkirk.
And when you say protector, you mean that the community kind of turned against her at that point, or took Jacob's side?
Yes, they did, and they stopped. Nobody would sell her food or supplies. They basically, the Icelandic church, which had a lot of power in those communities, determined to shun her. And the rationale, because I saw some information from one of the pastors there, was we are going to try to force this couple back together.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't trying to be cruel, though. Helga saw it as total rejection. She said, now at this point, Stephenson had moved to Western Canada, and Red Deer or a community, something like that. And so therefore he was gone. And many of the Icelanders had moved back up to Canada. And so therefore she felt her support system was gone. They wouldn't sell her material. She couldn't really survive. So Baldwin said, let's go back up to Canada. And they went to Selkirk, Canada. And in the midst of that, again, it was just such a broken time. But she, again, while she was in Gardner, she lost 3 children to diphtheria or smallpox. It's a little confusing, but I just randomly just picked up, just opened a page, and here on this tiny piece of land, I come to plant my sweetest flower in this sacred place, so peaceful and pretty. My baby's voice reaches out to me. I close my tired eyes and listen. My heart struggles to understand why. I wish I could leave this world and, dearest daughter, hold on to you forever. So I stare into a shallow grave that holds a little black cradle. My breathless baby stares up at me, and I will never be the same. I mean, just the tragedy. I mean, she lost 3 children in, when they were very young. She now has lost Frederica Josefina. Her marriage has crumbled, and her father takes her under his wing and says, let's go back. And they go up there, and before she's left, she's met a gentleman, Schooley, it's Arnie Schooley Freeman. And he ends up going up there and courting her. And he has lived in that area of North Dakota. And he is a horse breeder rancher who was born in Iceland and immigrated in about 1887. So in the mid 1890s, he starts courting her, and they get married and then move down to Crookston, Minnesota.
Which is not an Icelandic community, was it? Or was it? Not that I'm aware of.
It really wasn't, but what it was is he was this horse breeder, and he was sort of a mysterious person. Family history, again, his legal name is Schooley Arnie Stephenson Freeman. But he would never allow his photo to be taken. And there's family history that this guy swept in. He was a wonderful father in many ways, but there was a rumor that he had to leave Iceland because he got involved with some shady horse stealing.
Mm.
But what he did in Crookston and is he would do horse racing on the ice.
Which is basically a gambling event, right? It's people are betting on these horses. Yeah. Okay.
And in fact, one of the family stories is, again, he had this horse called Frank King. And apparently this was a famous horse. And he would do all this racing on the ice. And again, in Minnesota in the 1890s, this was a huge, huge deal.
Yeah. So they are successful financially from that.
They became very successful financially, but the cold, etc. They just decided to move, to move west. They wanted a fresh start,
mm-hmm.
And so they packed their bags and they moved. To Deer Island, Oregon. And part of it was Deer Island is a little community that was right on the river. One of the things that in Helga's story is she loved being close to the water. Mm-hmm. In fact, in some of her poems, she refers to the water sprites and the water fairies. And in fact, in the books that I've written, A World Away from Home, I try to go into, she was very, there was a lot of superstition, and she referred oftentimes to the mazes, the lava mazes around Mevaten, where she'd get lost. Mm-hmm. And there was a story that she would tell of Killer Skuta, who would hide in the mazes and capture children and take them out to Raven Island in Lake Mevaten. And so you always had to be careful. In fact, when I went to Iceland, my uncle and I, we explored those mazes. And after about a half an hour, got totally lost and started panicking because everything looks exactly the same. Right. And there were so many separations and paths. And we said, okay, this is what Helga was feeling as a small child. Right. Because it took us about an hour and a half to find our way out once we'd gotten lost. And a fascinating labyrinth of volcanic structures.
Yeah.
In fact, go ahead.
So tell me a little about. They go to Deer Island, and Arnie passes away after a time, right? And then she's sort of on her own, or how did she ended up in Christmas Valley, which is in Inland Valley? But maybe you can talk a little bit about that so we know.
Arnie was doing very well. I tend to call him Schooly in my novels. But sadly enough, he had an alcohol problem too. Now, he was not, in the family stories, we've got Jacob, who is sort of the mean alcoholic, and we have Schooly or Arnie, who was actually a kind-hearted alcoholic. Mm-hmm. But one of the stories is that he came home. Well, when Helga went home to her into Canada, back to Canada for her mother's funeral, mm-hmm. And the family kind of gathered there. And while he was gone, he ended up going to a lot of the bars and leaving 4-year-old Walter outside watching the horses. Mm. When Helga came home from Iceland, she heard these stories. From Canada, she heard these and was pretty upset. Sadly enough, though, he came home about a year later, from being out drinking. The wagon fell over on top of him.
Mm.
And Helga was apparently gone at that point. But Walter, my grandfather, at 4 years old, 4 or 5, spent the next hour trying to pull the wagon off his father while he died in front of him, and which was a trauma situation. She then heard stories of Christmas Lake Valley, and photography, and there were some pictures of it, and she said, this looks like Iceland.
Yeah.
It's
For people who don't know, many of the inland valleys in Northern California and Oregon are volcanic, and they do resemble Iceland to some degree. Yeah.
And she ended up saying, let's, that they had extended the donation land claim because nobody wanted this land. And so therefore they could get land for like $20 for a for a large portion of land, as long as they were there for 5 years and established a house, and was able to start farming the land. The dilemma so they went there because it reminded them of Iceland, and she tells stories of going to some of the lava areas that reminded her of Mývatn.
Yeah.
Now, the dilemma with what happened is they sold all this land at this cheap and got everybody over there, while there was a season of 4 or 5 years that was very wet.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is, while they were there, the water table lowered. So they were doing dry wheat farming. And at this point, again, she was still doing some poetry. But as you read earlier, after about 1900, she stopped doing a lot of the poems. But again, she, it was just, they couldn't make it there. And so they came home. And, but yet, that was what she called one of the best times of her life. I want to go back to one of the poems that she wrote just before she left Garter, because again, these poems are this was called The Swan in Me, because there was a part of her that she really identified with swans. And so me, the first phrase has to do with me, the second with the swan. So me, sing to me like swans love to sing. Sing like you sang so long ago. Haven't you waited too long to speak? Why do you continue to swim in silence? Don't you want to share wonderful words with all the dear people of this world? And then the swan responds, I'd love to sing, but I've lost my voice. My best words are not good enough. My phrases can't find the perfect pitch. Without the love I once had, nothing sounds right. I wish with all my heart you could feel the passion inside my poetry. And she wrote that right after the divorce from Jacob.
Yeah.
And in a way that became, even though she continued to write after that, her poetry shrunk, but she really truly lost her voice.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because just thinking of the period of time, there wasn't a lot of support for people facing alcoholism, as far as I know, or for families that were torn apart by it. And it sounds like she had a lot of trauma from losing her daughter and the marriage. And while poetry was sort of in some ways therapeutic for her, it sounds like she was sort of overcome by some of this trauma and couldn't really write poetry anymore. Is that how you would?
I think at that point it lost its excitement. I think part of it is Stephen Stephenson moving up to Red Deer. She lost that. I think Jacob, in the midst of his pathology, was a real encourager of her art.
I see. I
This
see.
this other lady, Carolina Dahlman, who was a big part of the Garter community, was a real encourager of her art. And again, she was a fiery woman. I
Mhm.
mean, just look at that picture of her.
Yeah.
I mean, she stood up, and her and Stefan and Carolina were big figures in getting the Icelandic Lutheran Church to give women the same rights as men.
Mhm.
And that was huge. Here's a picture of her and Jacob earlier.
Oh yeah.
And so, a handsome guy. In fact, here's a picture of her and Josephina, the girl that died, that was killed, and Jacob, and again, Baldwin, her father.
Mm-hmm.
So again, a fascinating community. In fact, here's the house in Garter that they lived in, North Dakota.
Yeah.
They moved to they moved to Deer Island. They went there, and Stephen became he was just an amazing photographer.
Wait, Stephen is there? Her son was Scully, or
Yes, well, she had two living children, Sophia and Stephen, from
okay?
Jacob,
Oh, I
and
see.
then Walter was from Scully. In fact, here's one of the photos that they took because Stephen wanted a Harley Davidson. And so his best
quickly
friend,
becoming American. Okay.
yep, becoming very much American. So he wanted a Harley Davidson. Here's actually the house in Christmas Lake Valley that they lived in.
Yeah.
So they created this community. Baldwin, being such a violinist and such a good musician, taught Walter at a very young age. And Helga was convinced that Walter was going to become a violinist virtuoso.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, at the age of 13, he had the top teacher in Portland who was a director, and said, of a number of the orchestras, and said, there's I can't teach you anything more. You are the best violinist on the West Coast, except for one person in San Francisco. You need to move to San Francisco to get any further.
Wow.
So again, fascinating family.
Yeah.
Just fascinating stories. So they ended up going back to Deer Island. And one of the poems she wrote when they went back was, I'm going to read, Life's Currents. Forward, forward, swim strong through the deadly currents. Do not hesitate, but dive deep into the water. Rest waits on the other side, beyond the noisy waves and the sound of sorrow. Our bodies may last, but our color fades. It is a strong struggle to cross the river. Darkness steals our strength and torments our time. But if our work is noble, our words will never die.
Wow.
Stefan Stephenson really tried to promote Helga, tried to get her to publish. He said that his work had really been captured by the Icelandic community in Iceland and in North America. He was doing a lot of tours around, literary reading tours. In fact, he in the early 1900s went back to Iceland and read his poems.
Yeah.
And said, Helga, you can do this. Write these poems. You've got all the poems, collect them together, and then go on tour with me. You can do this. We can do this as a team. But Helga believed that her sorrow was too personal.
Mhm.
She wrote it for friends, and even though she did publish in a number of Icelandic magazines and literary journals, most of it was because she was appeasing Stefan Stephenson because he wouldn't get off of her case.
Mhm.
But yet, to her, the sorrow, it shared almost too much of her heart. In fact, when I was a young child, and there was all the family members had this little book, this
Mhm.
book of poems by Helga, and I said, Grandpa, read me a poem, and he said, I never read her poems. I will break down. It's too sorrowful, and men do not cry. And if I read her poems out loud, if I translate them for you, it will break me up. But Sophia, her daughter, would talk to Stefan Stephenson. In fact, here's a great picture of Sophia. That's and she said, Mom, I want you to. We're gonna put together a manuscript. So I actually have the handwritten manuscript that Helga and Sophia put together, but Helga would not let Sophia send it into a publisher because at that point, there were several publishers in Reykjavik that were really ready for this, for her to publish. She died in 1941, and it took Sophia a couple of, she wanted to mourn and respect the memory.
Mhm.
So she didn't get the manuscript back to Reykjavik until about 1950, and in 1952, it was published. So finally, her poems made it out.
So after her death, but at the end of her life, she was honored in Washington, right? At Blaine, is that right?
Yes, in Blaine, Washington, she was asked to be the keynote speaker at an Icelandic picnic, and I actually closed the book because she wrote a speech poem, which apparently was pretty common at that point. Because I also some of the poems that I translated that Sophia included in the manuscript were letter poems.
Mm-hmm.
And apparently that was a fairly common thing. And so my people led me to this platform and gave me this very special moment. I love the songs, but they hold much sorrow. I live a life listening to distant rhythms. When young, I disappeared down paths of poetry. I've seen much, but still have little to offer. It brings me such pleasure to live long enough to join the joy of this glorious day. To be with beautiful people is a gift. So together we can start a bright new fire. But today I want to remind all my friends that it's often the struggles that keep us close. We are all people of the island, and today we should all smile and enjoy ourselves, but be careful of those with evil intent. For to gather in goodness is like heaven, where we can speak of our ancient land, for our words show where our hearts lie. We were born with beauty on a faraway island, which will always hold our first love. To leave that home was like losing our soul. For those who sailed away refused to give up hope. As a teenager, I carried a heavy cross. and I left behind my books and horses. But a fair wind blew the blooms west until we stood on sandy shores of the Pacific Ocean. Though times were hard, the great physician softened our sorrows, though we'll always know the pain. We stand here, but our hearts are far away. For who can forget the wonder of their first love?
Wow. That's a great way to end this conversation. I know you have her bracelet, which I'd like you to show everyone, because I think that that's just a physical manifestation of her.
You know, here's one of the bracelets that she came over from Iceland with. And again, she, you know, Iceland was always on her heart. Later on, she stopped writing poetry, but she said her pillows and her handicrafts were her poems. And so she did hundreds and would give away purses and pillows to everybody she met, because she said people need beauty in their life, and there is so much sorrow that her dream was, how do we keep the beauty going?
That's amazing. Well, I want to open it up if there's any questions in the Q&A that people have. This was a pretty heavy presentation, so I don't know if anyone has any questions, but it was really wonderful to learn about her and her poetry and her life. And of all the Westafar that I've heard of or read about, I really do get a strong sense from her that she really missed her homeland more so than is talked about by others. And she was more open with her emotions, I think, than many people were. So if there's any questions people have, now is a good time to ask.
And while we're waiting for that, Jason, you know what she really did miss, but yet she was afraid to go back. But my grandfather, ever since my first memories, was his dream was to go back to Mývatn, to go back to Iceland. And he passed away before he was able to do that. But one of the things that I did is I took his wife and my grandmother Blanche, my mother, an uncle, and I. We went back to Iceland. We went back to Mývatn. We went back to the farm where and the church where her mother and father were married. And we tried to speak to them. We did not know Icelandic, but we had brought the book of poems. So when we went to the house where she was raised, or she lived part of the time, we couldn't communicate, but we showed them the book, and suddenly they slammed the door on our face, and we thought, what, did we offend them? And suddenly a minute later they opened the door, they embraced us, and in their hand they had the same book of poetry. And we spent the next 2 or 3 days them showing us around that whole area of Iceland.
That's great. We have a comment. Thank you for this wonderful presentation. It was really great to discover this amazing artist in person. And then this is Leslie, and she asked, what's the best way to access her and your writing?
You know, it's really through Amazon. Again, the book of poetry, you can get there. The book, which really tells the story of her life, is I ended up having to do it in 2 volumes because my editor said, you know, an 800-page book is too long. So we divided it up. And the first one is A World Away from Home, because again, home was always Iceland. And the second one is Further from Home. And the picture on the cover is the picture that her son Stephen built for them in Christmas Lake Valley. That is actually their house.
Wow. All right, we have one more comment, not a question. This is from Edda. Not a question, but I wanted to say that her poems are very powerful. Thank you for this webinar. I'm on Amazon right now buying her poetry book. Okay, thank you, Edda. And from Edward, Talk was very curious about her relationship with Stephen Gay. Much appreciated. I oversee the Stephenson house. So you
Oh,
provided some important back stories about their relationship that people didn't know. So we thank you for that.
so the Stephenson, is this Schooley's house? Arnie Schooley?
No, I think it's the the Stephenson residency.
Okay, Stephen.
Parkerville, yeah.
Yes. Another interesting factor is one of her youngest brother, Ole Peter, had a mental breakdown, and Stephenson said, move him up here to Red Deer because they are opening up a
Mental health treatment.
Yeah, a hospital for the insane. And so therefore, Stephenson only went up there, stayed there for the next 20 years or so. And Stephenson regularly visited and took care of tracking him and sending letters back down to Deer Island. So Helga knew how her brother was being taken care of.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you so much for today. We really enjoyed having you. I think everybody learned a tremendous amount. And I was telling Suna that you're like a conduit of history because of your relationship with your grandfather. And just by chance, you know, you were able to talk to people who knew her and her life and took an interest yourself. So we appreciate that from you also, because we're also interested in people who went west. And so thank you for sharing. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. She is such a resilient, she's really an example of how to handle hardship and to continue and not give up. And she would say again, her poems are what kept her tethered to sanity.
Yeah. That's great. All right. Well, thank you, Stephen.
Thank you, Jason. It's just a great, and Icelandic Roots has been so helpful in figuring out and discovering more about her history.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Yep. Thank you.